So I'd like to welcome everybody to our webinar of how to put together a well thought out strategy for hiring an executive on your team. This presentation sort of came together after years of running a lot of executive searches for a variety of different clients. And what I found fascinating was that there was really multiple ways to do this. And so this topic formed from the idea of pulling together what I've seen as best practices and how to create a strategy for putting together your executive team. I guess I'll give you a little bit of background about myself. My name is Abbie Martin. I am one of the managing directors here at HireBetter. I know my bio says a little over 15 years. I think marketing was being judicious. It's probably a little over 20. But I have been working, I've worked for a very large government contractor, software company, and then I've spent the last 8 years on the agency side. For me, meaning recruiting really is my passion. So today I'm hoping to be able to give you at least a few tidbits, hopefully a lot of ideas on how you can better improve your hiring process. Just a little bit about HireBetter. We offer recruiting services. We do executive search as well as non-executive search. We can also help you have, when you have a short-term need, you need somebody for 3 months, 6 months, an exit is coming. We have an interim services team that can help you with that. We also offer some advisory services where we can help you with some strategic talent planning, where you have your current org chart, your future org chart, where you want to be. We help you create that, and then a plan for how to get there. And our newest offering this year, which has been really exciting, is creating a strategic executive onboarding program, which has really helped our clients increase their odds of making sure that the team that they have hired is fully integrated and set up for success. So like I mentioned, at the end of this webinar, I'm going to get you guys a copy of all of this plus a few extras. There is up there, if you go on the Q&A, you can send me a question at the end, and if we have time, I'll make sure that I get to some of those. So a little bit about what we'll be covering today. I'll go over this one quickly since we've got a lot of meat in here, and I actually took out some stuff to not have it be as much time. Well, we're going to talk a lot about preparation, the process that goes into the interview, some good interview questions that work, what to avoid after the interview, making the decision, closing the candidate, and some resources for you. So first we'll talk a little bit about before your interview, and this is where I get the most eye rolls. I was on a phone with a client this morning. I talked about the preparation piece, and he was like, "Abbie, you're killing me." This is probably going to be what a lot of people on the webinar say as well. But I promise you that if you spend your time preparing your process, everything before you actually get to the interview, you're actually saving your team countless hours and possible redirects. So before your actual interview, the question is why? Kind of obvious, but you'd be surprised at how many times people don't ask that. So one of the first questions we ask, are you upgrading? Are you fixing a problem? Maybe the problem is just that the person left. Have you asked yourself and the team, do we really need this role? Sometimes it's obvious, absolutely. Sometimes you can go through and you say, you know what, maybe we don't. What are the challenges that you're facing with not having this role? So that way you can remind the team and yourself, this is why you're doing this. So we're talking about before, and we're also, one of the things that I mentioned that I took out was our job description piece. I'm going to actually put together another webinar. I feel like it's some really good data, and it's the most tedious and overlooked part of a process that if you do it well can really be helpful. So if anybody here is interested in doing one of our job description webinars, then just let me know and I'll make sure you're invited to that. Second question to ask, what outcomes do you need from this person? I'm going to reference this particular component of before the interview several times throughout this talk today. If you could go through, and really take the extra step to say, here's exactly like what we need from this person. Sometimes it's very simple, and sometimes it's pretty complicated. And so taking that time will help you with knowing what the outcomes are, and then you can work backwards for what interview questions to ask, who needs to be a part of it. All of those things are very important. While you're defining these things, I think it's also really important to talk about what the impact of a bad hire is. So what would it do to the team? What would the cost be for your company? Typically 3 times the average salary or more if they're in a revenue producing role. Remind the team that their diligence up front will save the company a lot of potential lost revenue in the future. The other thing to really take note of is, who is this role going to impact? There are the reason we ask this is because I've seen, unfortunately, and it's misplaced fear a lot of times, but there are people who will sabotage candidates because they feel like they're going to threaten their place in the company ecosphere. So taking a little bit of time to think about who this role impacts and who should be a part of the hiring process because of that is very important. Making sure it's crystal clear about, you know, who's going to have a voting voice and who's just going to be, you know, part of the getting their feedback. I really appreciate it. But if you're working off of needing to get a consensus of a very large team, you can end up derailing your entire search, and just by fatigue alone or strong personalities end up getting the wrong person. All right, so now we'll talk a little bit, if we've gotten the legwork out of the way, we're going to talk a little bit about defining the process. We know why we need the role, who it's going to impact, the people it could threaten. So now we need to talk about who your decision makers are going to be. Do they know their role in the hiring process? The other reason this is so critical is if you realize late in the interview process that some of your decision makers didn't interview the candidate, they're going to have to come back repeatedly for extra interviews, and that's not always good on the candidate side. So write down what I suggest is 2 circles. So you have your decision makers, the ones that you know you have to have a unanimous decision amongst. 2 to 3 is usually my recommendation, and then you have the other group where their opinion is a part of it, but not necessarily part of that vote. And you're going to hear me say communicate about 10,000 times. And you want to do that in a PC way. You don't want people to feel like they don't have a voice, but a little bit of clarity and understanding what role they have in that will be really helpful. And because again, trying to get consensus, you could be held hostage for weeks, you know, trying to make that decision. So once you've defined your 2 tiers of interviewers, it's the time to get commitment that you're aligned with, one, that you need the role, and what the key outcomes of having this person on the team. So document it, and document that everyone has given their agreement. So the email is, you know, per our agreement, here's the things that we're looking for. We're all committed to that. You have that piece to go back to, because everybody, we're going to talk about traveling and just, you know, multiple interviews, things going on. It's going to end up being, it can get a little bit convoluted. So having that piece down is really helpful. The other piece is aligning on what the actual job responsibilities will be. So what will this person actually have purview over? Who are their direct reports? Have you eliminated as many dotted lines as possible? And then you want to get confirmation from your decision makers that you're in agreement on what that right skill set is. So you have, I call it alignment, right? So I recommend breaking it out into your non-negotiables and your nice to haves. So your non-negotiables, keep them short, 3 to 5 things, and keep those sacred. And then the rest you can put. Even though some of them might feel like they're non-negotiable, that list being a little bit longer will be helpful for you. So the biggest challenge in hiring an executive, and I would say it's anybody, but typically more so on the executive side of hiring, is finding that it's not finding the right person. It's not even being able to get enough interviews into the table. What I find the most challenging piece is the game of calendaring. So, you know, the executives doing the hiring are typically booked weeks in advance. They have a really busy travel schedule. And what's typically not taken into consideration is that executive candidate has just a hectic of a calendar. So I've spent sometimes, I've had up to 3 to 4 weeks of a lag time before I can get an interview scheduled. And while it's typically pretty acceptable, it's normal, people understand that, it can be a real issue in a candidate-driven market when other companies are moving faster, or maybe they've been in a process a little bit longer with somebody else. So it's important to be able to figure out where you can and can't speed that up a little bit. Another commitment for you here. The piece is it's commitment, getting your team to commit to being available. We've tried a multitude of methods, you know, asking team to block off times. So I've had some CEOs say, okay, every Tuesday, Thursday for the next 12 weeks from 2 to 4, I will keep that time open for you. If you don't have me booked, you know, by a couple days beforehand, I'll probably use that time, but I will keep those things open. Asking your team to maybe block off some time or to do what they can to make themselves available with whoever is doing that scheduling. It will go a long way in helping you move a little bit faster, with the goal being we don't want to lose out on a great fit. So there's another, communicate that process. You have to, you know, you've gotten, your team is defined, you've gotten commitment from everybody on making the time, you've gotten the job description, your key outcomes. So then you want to go through and talk about what that process looks like. And the way that I like to do that is to say, okay, ideally we have this start date, and in an ideal world. So here's the start date, let's work our way back. You want somebody to start by September 1. An executive is usually going to have a 3 to 4 week time from the accepting the offer to when they can actually start. Non-executive is usually 2 weeks. Sometimes it can be longer. So then from there, when do you need to have the offer out? Because there's usually a week to 2 weeks for negotiation. You can just work your way backwards from there in terms of figuring out, you know, what your timetables need to look like. And so for this chunk of time during this month, please everybody try and do what you can to make yourself available for this. So you've done a lot of that legwork, you've gotten your process figured out, and then something that I do like to say a lot is, then be ready for nothing to go as you planned. And one of those things is when referrals come into play. So there's really something that happens to the search process. When people are coming in from outside, they don't have any relationships with anybody, you're able to look at them objectively. And when referrals come into play, you know, it depends on who referred them. You know, when were they put into the process? Well, I don't want to upset that person. You know, that person has a dotted line to me. So if I don't like them, that could mean, you know, there could be negatives to me. So I like to counsel everybody to really have a plan in place for how you're going to handle referrals. You know, putting it out there. There's nothing wrong with getting referrals. You can get some great people, but being upfront with the people who referred them, they're going to have to go through the same process that everybody else goes through, so you can do an apples to apples comparison, and then that will take away a lot of the conflict that comes from people when they don't know how to handle it being a referral. So agree as a team upfront on how referrals will be handled, and then I didn't put it down, but of course document and get commitment on that. The other thing I think is worth talking about is when you're doing a confidential search, being very clear from time to time. Maybe the person that you're looking to replace is in the role. Maybe, you know, there could be a variety of things. Maybe you don't want, and I've had we don't want our competitors to know that we're looking for this role. There could be a variety of different things. So you really want to make sure that you talk about that so people know very clearly who they can and can't talk to about this role being open, which could just save you some embarrassment in the long run. So. All right, now we can get to what I call the fun part, which is more the art. I call this the dance. Hiring to me is a lot like dating somebody. You have to worry about, you know, first impressions. Do they like me? Why do I feel so insecure around them? Is this really the right partner for me? Or is it just the best person that's asked me out? A lot of times that's part of what we do. Is this really the best person for the role, which is why. I go on and on about doing your key outcomes in the very beginning, so that way you don't tend to just be like, I'm tired of interviewing. This is the best person of the group versus this is the best person for the job. So first things first, is part of the art or the dance, whatever you want to call it, is really who's going to greet your candidates. A lot of times there's stuff that happens there's always phone work that gets them to come into the office. I'm super passionate about having my clients create a positive candidate experience. And really the first impression they're going to have is when they come into your office and who's going to greet them. So obviously having great work on the phone is great, but when they come in, were they greeted? Were they given something to drink? Did the person, know to expect them? Were they offered, hey, if you need to use the bathroom, and given a timeline, hey, okay, the hiring manager knows you're here, you should be down in about 5 minutes. Those types of things can matter. If you don't have somebody at the front desk, then put a reminder on your calendar to be available and to be close. I've had it happen way too many times. The candidate calls me, they're like, I don't know where to go. There's nobody at the door. I rang the bell and I'm just standing here. Am I in the right place? That type of thing. And if you've got meetings backed right up into there, and it goes long, the person ends up sitting out there and they're, you're late to the date and it doesn't feel good. So making sure that they have a really positive first impression when they come in. The other thing that I find to be extremely helpful for you in terms of making a decision is including the person at your front desk, or however that's going to work for you, in on the process a little bit. I would come every day. I would give the front desk person a list of everybody that was going to be coming down, who they were going to be meeting with, so that they knew exactly who to call. There wasn't any confusion. The candidate didn't have to remember details, and then they had a space on that piece of paper to tell me what that person was like. Were they nice to them? Did they smile to people? Were they rude? Wishing we had hidden cameras for the multitude of times when I heard some really horrible things that people would say. And then the minute the executive would come down to get them, they would, flip the switch and be completely different. So highly recommend incorporating some feedback from your front desk person just to kind of get their take on them. The second piece is your team prepared? Do they have the job description? Do they know those key outcomes that this role has to have accomplished? Do they know who's interviewing before them? Do they know who's interviewing after them? Do they know what to do with the candidate? Time and time again, well, I sat in the office while the person went and figured out what I was supposed to be doing, that type of thing. So making sure that you guys look like you're a well-oiled machine is important. The second thing is to know what roles everybody is playing. And I know that sounds a little bit funny, but when you're putting together who's in your team, you want to know who's the subject matter expert, okay? Who's the person that's going to go in? I really don't want to know about your kids or any of that stuff. If somebody else is going to find out about that, I want to know, can you do this job? Let's geek out a little bit. If it's a developer job, whatever it is, let's really talk about it. My job is to understand and be able to tell the team, this person knows what they're talking about. You want to have somebody, and sometimes these can be multiple, like the same person, right? But these are the three things that you want to incorporate. You want to know if they're a culture fit. How would you define your culture? What's going to be the wrong person? If somebody comes in and they're extremely aggressive, and some cultures that works really well, and some it would really be a detriment. So this person's job is to really assess, are they a culture fit? And then I put on here, you need your sales guy. And this isn't, the typical salesperson, but this is the person. Sometimes it's HR, sometimes it's just another person on the team who can give you the Jerry Maguire speech. This is why I love working here. So when the candidate walks away, they know, oh, I can do this job. I'm going to fit in here. And wow, I feel really good after talking to that person. I don't know why, but wow, they loved it. So they love it here so much. I'm certainly going to love it. So having people play that role and being clear of like, hey, you know, I know you could also be the subject matter expert, but I really also need to make sure that you know how to suss out that culture fit is important. And then knowing, you know, did the candidate walk away with a picture of what it would really look like to work there? So that's, you know, giving them some pictures of some things, talking about some things of what they would actually be doing, some actual issues, things that you're fitting into, you know, things that they're actually going to be working on, talking about the structure, and then getting them a little bit excited about what they could accomplish there. The other thing that's super important is making sure, and it's overlooked, if somebody is there to share the benefits. You'd be surprised at what a pivotal role that plays. There's a lot of time, even on the initial call with a candidate, before we can even get them in the door. They're like, hold on, I'd like to know what the cost of the benefits are. I'd like to know what the overall picture of it is, because they're going to, before they'll even say, yes, I'll talk to you about the role, they're not going to take a job where the benefits are significantly worse. You know, or the cost is going to be excessive to them. So it's important that somebody in your process has that information, and you know, a lot of times, like I would always hand a benefits brochure at the end. Nowadays, you know, it can be electronic, but just making sure that they have that before they leave that first interview is important. And then last, it's setting the expectations of follow-up. So there really should be a point person that the candidate and your team needs to know who your point person is, letting the candidate know, and then putting that on the calendar. Not on the candidate's calendar, but your calendar. You know, whoever is doing that, I have to get back to this person by this point. I need team feedback by this date. So the worst part of being a candidate is having an interview and then not knowing, you know, like, how did I do? Did they like me? You know, did they want to go out on a second date? Like, did I say that wrong? All of those things, it's no different. It plays through their head. And even if you're going to call them right after and be like, really appreciate the time that you gave us, and we're not gonna move forward with you, you don't need to tell them why. You don't have to give them the details or do a comparison, but there's nothing worse than just being ghosted. And so my suggestion is just making sure that you've got a process set up so that nobody gets ghosted. All right, so you've done the legwork, you've gotten candidates in the door, your team is prepared, they know the roles that they're going to play. Now you have to do the interview. A lot of times I get feedback from a candidate and I hear it was really just a free flow conversation. I don't know if they asked me but one or two questions. And then the hiring manager calls me and they're like, oh, this was the best interview ever. And I'm confused. I'm like, how do you know if they're a good fit? I don't know. I just really like them. So, you know, there are some very savvy candidates out there that can get the hiring manager talking about themselves. And the hiring manager then walks away feeling really, really positive about the interview, but nothing of substance was discussed. So my intention of talking about some of these things to help you on the interview questions is so that you can help put together a few things to negate that fact, because it does happen way more than you would think. And the first piece to that is really putting together a list of questions. I recommend having at least 5 questions that you will ask every single candidate for the role. No matter who they are. After that those 5 questions, you then can actually have an apples to apples comparison of everybody. And then if you like them, they've answered it really well, then you continue to go deeper. If not, you can say, you know what, I've done this piece, I'm gonna wrap this up and move on, and that's okay. But the having those 5 questions and having them set and having them all be the same really helps you with an apples to apples comparison. So when you're getting into the interview, one of the first things that most everybody wants to do and can end up spending a lot of time doing is going through their history. Take me through your resume. Talk to me about why you changed, you know, jobs. My suggestion is save 15 minutes in the beginning of the interview. It's important. You are going to get a lot out of it. If it's 15 to 20 minutes, that's okay, but you want to make sure you've left time for the other pieces. So you want to go through, help me understand your motivation behind each change, but please let's not take more than 15 minutes, because there are people who they've perfected the art of telling you their story, and a whole hour can go by, and then you realize, wow, we've talked about nothing else. As you're going through that, you really want to like, okay, talk to me about what you did there. People will say, tell me your accomplishments. I like to go a little bit deeper. Talk to me about the impact that you had on that role. It's a question that makes them, like, stops people from having a more pat, rehearsed answer. So talk to me, you know, about the impact that you've made, and usually, you know, they'll be able to give you something. Sometimes when you ask a question like this, candidates need a minute to think about it. And what I found is it's taken some practice, but you need to then be quiet. I've had a candidate say, can I just, like, give me 1 second to think about that. Take your time, and then you as the person interviewing need to be quiet. Just, even if it takes 2 minutes of uncomfortable silence, look down, write something, you know, give them a minute to think about it, because as soon as they get that minute, because they're in an interview, they're on their first date, they're nervous, things come up. And then I've had a few people choke, like, I'm really sorry, I can't think of something. And I say, that's fine, we'll come back to it. And then we circle back and they have a minute, or sometimes in the middle of another question, they'll say, oh, I remember. And that's good. But giving them a minute to actually think about that and not filling in the answer for them, which is what I find a lot of hiring managers do, because you feel bad because the person's on the spot. All right, so talked about these key competencies. I use the word key competencies, success factors, key outcomes, whatever you want to call it. This is where, you know, you're going to be really glad you came up with these, with that list for yourself when you're coming in there. So you want to create some questions. They're going to suss out some examples of how they've already done what you're looking for, or how they would approach it, right? Not every time they've already done it. So I'll give you an example. Give me an example, so-and-so, of a strategy that you created and deployed that drove growth in your sales team at such and such company. So that's a very, you know, direct question. Then they're going to say, oh, I drove growth. Okay, tell me what that growth meant. You know, so, well, okay, I guess at the end of the day, it was like 2%. So, you know, what does that 2% mean? That 2% could mean many, many different things depending on what the size of the company was. So every question that you ask 2 to 3 follow-up questions. It's easy just to say, oh, okay, tell me more about that. Dig deeper on these key competencies, because a lot of times people come pretty prepared. You know, they've looked at the job description and they can have a pat answer. But you go to question number 2, you go to question number 3, and people, I would say, you know, 98% of the interviews that I've done, you can't think that fast to come up with something that's completely false. And so usually you'll get the truth of what they've done. This is another one that I feel like is super important. And the question is, what's been your biggest career failure to date? Give me an autopsy of it, why it happened, and what you learned from it. A lot of people don't want to go into the negative piece, but I feel like you'll learn more from somebody's failure than all of their successes combined. And if they don't have any failures, then a lot of times I don't feel like that person is able to really honestly assess themselves, or you know, or they're just not being truthful. There's another one that I coach a lot of my hiring managers to be prepared with when you're talking to an executive candidate. And you need to be prepared with 3 challenges that you are currently facing that you would like to talk to them about. Make sure that, you know, you're picking challenges that you're comfortable sharing if they haven't signed an NDA, or if they've signed an NDA, then you can be a little bit more forthcoming. But thinking that through in terms of, you know, what are some things that we can sink our teeth in together and really talk about is really helpful. You can see how you bounce ideas off of each other. You see how their mind works. One of the best interviews I've ever been in, you know, explained the process, and then this person got up and then whiteboarded everything and then said, okay, I would move this here and I would move this here. And everybody else on the team who didn't do that process was like, no, I just don't think that's the right person. And I was like, I don't think you understand what they did. And we hired them, and for 10 years that person was, I mean, just an amazing rock star. So being able to talk about something in real time to whatever degree you're comfortable with, I think is very important. All right, so just like there's some dating cliches, there's some interviewing cliches, and I've been told to give you all a note here that these are my personal opinions. They don't reflect on HireBetter. No, I'm kidding. But I've sat through a lot of interviews and a lot of presentations, and so I've put together a few things where I feel like it's super important. If you can avoid these, they help you with a much better process. And the first might surprise you, but it's a typical 30, 60, 90-day plan. I went through probably a year or 2 years where this seemed to be all of the rage. And so we would have every candidate would come in, they would get a little bit of data maybe on the client or maybe not, and they would be asked, come give us your 30, 60, 90-day plan. And after about the second week, I realized, oh my gosh, they're all the same. I mean, literally, somebody could have just put it on, it is on the internet, they put it on there, or they, took it from getting their MBA, and they came in and they just give you the outline of what they would do for the first 30, 60 days. It's not, that piece isn't rocket science anymore. So I really, taking you back to the thing of giving them the 3 challenges, this is a really good time instead to put that in there. I will say this, I've had candidates really start to resist when we're getting into some of this, particularly the 30, 60, 90-day plans. If they don't feel like they're really one of the final people, like if they're like, oh, we're going to have 5 people come and do this, they're like, so basically what you want from me is some free consulting is how they feel. And it's a lot of time and effort. They're putting together a whole presentation. I think there's some value to it to a degree in terms of if they're in a revenue producing role, sales role, of like how are they going to be in a presentation mode. But if you think you're going to get something of value really out of a typical 30, 60, 90-day plan, I have found that that's been a big waste of time to most of my clients. The second one, and I wish we had the video on so I could see everybody's faces, is to ask somebody what their strengths, tell me what your strengths and weaknesses are. It's really lost its effect. Everybody knows it's coming. Everybody's practiced it. And I guarantee every one of you would raise your hands, or if I did a poll, I should do that next time. How many times have you heard, I work too hard, or I take on too much as my weakness? It's just what everybody says. Most people are just, they're not going to tell you, well, if I'm overworked, I can't really process more than one thing at one time, and I'll probably bite my team's head off, at the end of the month, or whatever the case may be. So the question I would suggest for everybody instead, I say, pretend I'm going to call your last boss or your current boss. What's the feedback or the criticism that they're going to say that they gave you on your last review for you to improve upon? Again, it's super direct, and unless they're just that quick on their feet, I could probably do a whole nother thing of the honesty that comes out of people. Nobody's perfect. We all have things that we can improve on. And so asking a question in that way gets you way more than the typical, what would you say are your weakness, your biggest weakness is. All right, this one also might seem a little bit obvious, but I find interviewing is a skill, right? And so asking behavioral type interview questions are also really a skill. So the concept behind a behavioral interview is your past behavior is an indicator of future behavior. So give me an example of a time when you faced this situation, and then and give them specifics, and then use your follow-up, 2 to 3 after that, knowing that it is going to take a little bit of extra time. So whoever is doing this, for you in that part, they need to have a little bit longer than your, rah-rah type person, okay? All right, I mentioned this before, and I think it's important enough to mention again, and it happens famously, usually in the sales organization, but a lot of times it's across the board. And hiring managers always and forever, really love it if they end up talking about themselves a lot. I think it's human nature, but you want to make sure that the candidate is sold on you, sold on the company, and knows about you, but you as the hiring manager, or you if you're coaching your team, You want to make sure that the candidate is doing 75% of the talking. You won't feel as good afterwards, but you will have way more of your questions answered, and the candidate is going to leave feeling really, really good because they just talked about themselves and bragged about themselves for a couple hours, and so they'll feel really happy, but you're going to understand what their real capabilities are instead. All right, something else to avoid is excessive interviews. So I guess what I would say to you is interview fatigue is real. You know, if you don't have a clear, defined process up front, well, let me have you talk to this person. Oh, let me have you talk to this person. Oh, one more, you know, oh, you know what? Let me go throw this last assessment in. It's different than if we tell, and I've had this, listen, you're going to have, you know, 4 interviews up front, then you're going to have a gauntlet interview, and then we're going to take you through a panel of assessments, you know, where you're going to, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with all of that as long as it's communicated up front. So, you know, if this person knows what they're getting into, that feels a lot better than looking like you don't have your act together and just throwing stuff in there. Oh, we'll just do that. Oh, we'll just do that. So putting that, you know, I think you guys get the point. Keep your situation, your interview process tight, and the candidates will really have a much better candidate experience. All right, so you've defined the role, you've created your process, you've now done really amazing interviews, and so your team is tired. They've been doing all of these interviews, they need to get their jobs done, and they will say, oh, you know what, I'm going to go back and I'll get that, I'll send that feedback over later. And I would say, I don't know what the percentage is, but at least 70% of the time probably, they don't get their initial feedback down. And so it gets, you know, the longer they get away from the interview, the real feedback gets diluted. So what I would tell you is meet with the team quickly. There should be a time clock ticking as soon as they finish their interview for how long they have to get, you know, back their feedback on the candidates. Like I said, memories start to fade, so you want to do a quick scorecard. You know, hey, if you don't have time to do some of these things, make sure you send our point person and, you know, your interview feedback. There's got to be somebody that's collecting that information, and so, you know, giving everybody a deadline. After you interview, you have 24 hours, you have 2 hours, whatever works in your environment, but set a deadline so that you can get that feedback quickly. Touched on this a little bit, but I feel like it's super important is the follow through with each of the candidates, them knowing what their timeline is when they leave your office. So it's different up front, you know, they kind of know, so okay, we're interviewing quite a large group of candidates. So, you know, I'll be able to tell you what's going to happen in the next 2 weeks. That's fine, they can live with that versus sitting there going, I don't know, I just don't know, maybe they, you know, and then they don't want to look desperate and call whoever the person is. And then it gives them time to get a little bit more comfortable back in the situation that they've been in. So following through, keeping everything moving is important. And I've mentioned this a couple times, but one point of contact. If you have one person, you know, there are some roles, particularly, I would say more so in the sales, where, you know, that's in their DNA to go around somebody and get to the decision maker. And what you want to avoid is being the person where, you know, they go around, they get to that person, they start getting told different stories, and then people lose sight of who's in charge of running that process. Oh, so-and-so's handling that. Oh, so, and then nobody's actually handling it. So one person, the buck stops with them. I highly recommend working with that type of format. All right, then the fun part. There's a few things we can talk about before pulling the trigger on your decision. And the first is just to say, sit back and say, is there any bias that I'm making in this decision? And this probably isn't as volatile as how I'm making that sound. I mean, but what I've found is that a lot of times teams end up in human nature saying, you hire what's most like you versus what's the right fit. Just because the person has the same style, the same personality, you have things in common, they feel better to hire versus the person that was really more qualified. So, you know, it's just a good question to sit back and ask, is there any bias? You know, is this really the right person, you know, the right qualified person versus who I like better? The other thing that I've seen happen, because it can go on the other side, is, so for example, I've had, you know, clients they've been burned, right? Somebody quit, or they had a certain personality trait, and for whatever reason, the person that they interviewed said something similar, looks the same, came from a similar type of background, and they immediately shut down and say, you know, nope, can't hire that person. They remind me of that person. And so I feel like it's a good practice to step back from that, because just because that person has said something similar doesn't mean they're going to do the exact same thing. So just taking a step, looking at whatever bias might be there, I think is really helpful. I mentioned scorecards. I think that they're a really good way to ensure that everyone in the process has evaluated the candidate in the same manner. So we're going to send you a template of one that you can use. What will make your life easier, if you did your key competencies in the very beginning, all you have to do is put those into your scorecard. You know, how did this person rank with this? You can get very complicated if you want. You can weight each one. You can do all of that, whatever works within your structure. But having something where you can visually see how a candidate ranks is a lot. It's way easier to make that decision versus, well, this is what I feel. You know, so you've got a little bit of data. When you're thinking about making your choice, some of the things that I see hold up a process of making a choice is there's sometimes fear of making the wrong choice, you know, for maybe whatever reason, the person who left the role, you know, people, it can get complicated with what people get scared about. And so one of the things I laugh on, like, people in our industry don't like to hear this, but when you're making decisions about human beings from human beings, as data driven as we try to be, we still don't always get it right. I mean, you never know how a person is really going to show up until they actually show up. So the best way that I know how to mitigate that is to really have those expected outcomes, and knowing what you're going to be holding that person accountable to is the best way to make sure, you know, that, like, okay, like I know that I'm scared of making this choice, but I feel like I've made as data driven a decision as I possibly can. And at the end of the day, you know, if you make a bad choice, I always say we just have to make another one, right? And one of the other things that happens a lot on making the wrong choice, or people say like, oh, this just wasn't the right fit. A lot of times what the feedback I get back from a candidate, there really was no clarity, you know, on what was really expected of me. So I was just sort of thrown in, and I was trying to get it all figured out. So all of that legwork really helps you in a multitude of ways, from you know, doing as much as you can to avoid making the wrong choice. So, all right, this is another fun part of the job, at least from my end. I enjoy it, but it's also really one of the most stressful parts for everybody involved. This is typically when the hiring manager suddenly has to get real about their budget, and the candidate suddenly goes, oh, this is how it's going to affect my life. You know, it's going to change this, it's going to change this. And, you know, I didn't really cover this with my significant other. That happens more times than I can count. You know, at the point when we get to the close, it's sort of like, oh, this just got real. And so it's important to be able to know that that's coming, I guess is what I want to say. So question, you know, who's going to be doing the negotiating? Is it the person who was the point person through the whole thing? I find that a lot of times in the process, the hiring manager wants to do it because it's their relationship, and they want to do that. This is, again, my personal experience and opinion, but I feel like that's typically the wrong person to do it, because emotions always get heightened on both sides. You know, they both want to feel like they're winning. They both want to feel like they're valued. It's just this human nature thing that kicks in. So the hiring manager always wants to haggle down the salary, even though they told me from the very beginning, like, I'll do whatever it takes. and then the candidate almost always wants to ask for more than what they said in the beginning. It's just, it happens every time. And then the candidate gets upset because they didn't get nearly as much as they kind of dreamt it, started to dream it up in their head, and the hiring manager gets upset because, you know, they were very clear, you know, that they didn't want to go over a certain amount. So having an intermediary is really the person that takes the heat. It's the person that stays neutral and also takes the blame. So, you know, when I call a hiring manager and I'm like, okay, listen, blah, 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 they can be mad at me and take, you know, and be upset with me. And then same thing with the candidate. And I never have to tell the other what they said. And so it saves them from being upset. And then when they start, you've already negated some baggage. I just love that concept of having your negotiator in there. And whoever's going to be doing your negotiation, you want to make sure they have some authority and have some guidelines. So it's not always, you know, going to buy a used car. I don't know. Let me go talk to the man behind the curtain and come back. So having a little bit, you know, knowing your final line, all of that good stuff. We could probably do a whole nother thing just on negotiation. So second piece, I know I'm kind of driving in this point, but define and document your outcomes that you need. We've been doing this with our onboarding program, and it has made the success of a candidate so much stronger. And you know, the percentage wise is incredible in terms of when somebody comes in and they know exactly what their outcomes are and you know what you're looking for, you really are setting yourself up and for more success. And during the close, why I put this in here, so somebody says, okay, I know exactly what's being asked of me. I know exactly, you know, because I hear a lot of times, well, if I had known, I would have asked for more salary, you know, that type of thing. So you're really getting that out in the beginning part of the process. The other thing is understanding, you know, we've talked about, you know, the bad cost of a hire, 3 times their salary. What milestones do you need to set that are non-negotiable that for you will say this person has been a successful hire? They don't need to be, you know, 20 pages long, but a couple of things for you to go through and say, if they have not hit this milestone, I probably need to go back and take a look at them and go have a conversation. Super important and takes the stress out of because you're busy doing your job, right? So having that thought out in advance, I think will save you a lot of heartache. All right, I've been trying to go through to get through us here a little bit faster. And so the last thing that we'll talk about is just a couple of resources. We're going to send you this webinar. You'll have that. You can always go back and listen to me talk to you about defining everything. And we're also going to send you a template of a scorecard. And you'll get an ebook that we have that'll just help you go a little bit deeper on identifying, recruiting, and retaining some great employees. So I'm going to go look and see if there's any questions that we have before we wrap this up and see. If you have any, you're more than welcome to send them to me. And also afterwards, you guys have my contact information if there's something that I didn't get to answer, you know, because of our timing and you want to go through. I'm happy to spend a little bit of time with anybody. All right, so the first question I see here, preparing for an executive interview, how is it different than entry and mid-level interviews? So that's a really good question. I think entry level, you can ask less questions and maybe they don't have to go through as many on the other end. You have same thing for mid-level, you can go, you know, a little bit more, and executives tend to be a little bit more thorough. So when you're preparing, you know, keeping your questions, and my big thing is that consistency piece. All right, I see one more question. Okay, appropriate. What is an appropriate timeline to follow up after the interview, as well as a hiring timeline? At what point does the candidate start to think the process is taking too long? Oh, that's a fabulous question. Okay, so an appropriate timeline, I think everything always depends, right? Being clear and upfront about that is important. Anywhere from 30 days, you know, at the non-exec time, from getting, you know, into there and to the close is really good for your entry-level and mid-level type roles, maybe up to 45 days. A lot of times that depends on the schedules. When you have a timeline for the executives, it can take longer. Most of the time that's because of availability. And at what point, and so let me go back and answer that. I think 2 months is enough and should be enough. And if it's going to go longer than that, there needs to be some that point person is talking to them about why that's happening, you know, so that they're not getting frustrated with that. Yeah, so the question was, at what point does the candidate start to think the process is taking too long? And I think after that point, it's a little bit too long. So, all right, I see one other question being typed, but for time's sake, I'm going to go ahead and wrap us up. My hope is that you are walking away with a few key points. Define what you're looking for, define the roles on your team and who's going to be part of the process, document it, communicate it, and then always have somebody who's going to follow up. So I really appreciate everybody joining us for this webinar. I hope you'll join us for more, and I welcome any of you to reach out to me after this if you have any more questions.